Everything you think you know about the relationship between the Soviets and the Nazis before, during, and after World War II is incorrect. Many people know about the Non Aggression Pact signed between these two nations, known as the Molotov Ribbentrop Pact, and many more do not. Many know of the brief period of supposed neutrality which existed between these two nations, from the late 30s to the early 40s, while others downplay this as the Soviet Union merely buying time before it could attack the Nazis when they weren't looking. But what are the facts behind this intriguing era, and just how deep does the rabbit hole go? Before we discuss at any length the relationship between the Soviet state and the Third Reich, we have to lay down precedent. Precedent which is to be found in the arm of Stalinism in Germany, the Communist Party of Germany, or the KPD for short, which was dominated by the influence of Stalinism through individuals such as Ernst Thälmann, who led the party. Before being banned in 1933, the Stalinist KPD had tried its very best to befriend the Nazis in every way that they could. The anti-Social Democratic Party referendum in Prussia was backed by not only Hitler's Nazis, but by the KPD, which publicly announced on July 22nd of 1931 that it would join the Nazi-initiated plebiscite in order to overthrow the SPD government. On November 1st of 1931, the KPD newspaper Rote Fahne published an open letter to the, quote, fellow workers of the Nazi Party and its stormtroopers, declaring the Nazis to be honest fighters against the hunger system. But this collaboration wasn't new, which one ought to find extremely surprising, at least at first. The fact was that not just in 1930, 1931, and 1932, but going way back into 1924, the KPD of Germany voted on the same side as the Nazi Party in the Reichstag 7 times out of 10. The KPD, the NVP, and the Nazi Party ended up aligning the most frequently out of all of the parties in the Reichstag, followed by the close alignment of the Social Democrats and Catholic Centrum Party, which themselves tended to vote together as a bloc. There were more votes shared between the Nazi Party and the KPD than between any combination of the other parties within the German government at any point since 1924. Throughout the entire period of 1924 to 1932, between the 197 votes taken by the government, in 145 of those votes, the KPD aligned themselves with the Nazi Party. KPD leaflets took up statements such as "Down with the Jewish Republic" to appease Nazi voters as well. Pravda, the official newspaper of Soviet Russia, having heard of the new events, expressed that the rise of the Nazis could only mean that new millions have awakened from their political winter sleep. Early in the 1930s, the quasi-Nazistic strategy of the KPD had its greatest outward expression in the creation of the communist-aligned Steringerstaffel in Linden, Germany. This unit was headed by Richard Staringer, a German lieutenant formerly belonging to the National Socialist Party. In March of 1931, after leaving prison, Scheringer was again in the news, as he had been before, for his move from the National Socialist Party to the Communist Party. The Steringerstaffel unit went so far as to wear SA uniforms, which were then adorned with symbols of the Soviet Union as part of Richard Scheringer's attempt to bring National Socialists into the Communist Party. The KPD would use his example to encourage other members of the National Socialists to join the Communists. What is being shown in front of you on screen now is an image of a KPD militia known as the Rote Front in Dresden in February of 1933. One can only guess where the Communists gained the inspiration for such a march from. The KPD strategy would become known as the Scheringer Kurz strategy, mixing Marxist and Nazistic elements to appeal to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Rudolf Diels, the first head of the Gestapo, pointed out that in Berlin, 70% of the new recruits to the Nazis' militant SA since January of 1933 had been former militants of the Communist Party of Germany. One of the most interesting facts provided by Diels was that entire KPD Rote Front units had been moved into the Nazis' SA. Albert Gruszinski, social democrat and head of the Berlin police between 1930 and 1932, pointed out that around a third of the members of the SA in Berlin were ex-communists as early as 1932. Hans Bernd Gisevius, an undercover member of the opposition to the Nazi regime and part of the secret police, noted that at least one-third of SA members in 1933 were former Communist Party members. These SA members were known as Nazi Rindersteak or beefsteak in reference to them being brown shirts on the outside and red Marxists on the inside. The SA themselves calculated that 50% of their members had come from the ranks of the communists, and reports from both the Gestapo and KPD intelligence confirmed a considerable presence of former communists within the SA. For example, in the Altona district of Hamburg, between 30 and 50 of the SA's 50 members had been communists before, including the right hand of the leader of Altona SS unit. A KPD propaganda piece meant to attract Nazi sympathy can be seen here, and an image of two National Socialist and KPD members on strike together should be seen here. This photo was taken from the 1932 Berlin transport strike, where both the Communist RGO and National Socialist Factory Cell organization worked together with KPD and Nazi street fighters, blocking depots, fighting the police, and sabotaging BVG service, sometimes together. Despite being nominally against the Nazis, leader of the KPD, Ernst Thälmann, himself believed that the Nazis should be allowed to rise to power first to make a communist revolution in Germany more politically expedient. Importantly, Joseph Stalin, when Hitler finally did rise to power, did absolutely nothing to oppose the rise of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, despite the large presence of the KPD, which took directive directly from him. Stalin lost his ideological grip over the nation entirely as the KPD was quickly banned by the Reich government in 1933. So much for internationalism. Let's fast forward about 6 years to Berlin on April 17th of 1939, after the Treaty of Rapallo, where the Russian ambassador reported to the State Secretary of the Third Reich, "There exists, for Russia, no reason why she, Germany, should not live with us on a normal footing, and from normal, the relations might become better and better." In August of 1939, as German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop prepared to visit Moscow, the German ambassador reported that Soviet Foreign Commissar Molotov was unusually receptive. Von der Schulenburg cabled Berlin that Molotov found the invitation very flattering, an actual proof of our good intentions, and clearly expressed a wish to conclude a non-aggression pact. Just as Stalin would state on August 23rd of 1939, "I know how much the German nation loves its Führer. I should therefore like to drink to his health." Hitler would invade Poland on September 1st of 1939, and 7 days later, Molotov, the lead diplomat of Russia, would relay to the German ambassador, "Please convey my congratulations and greetings to the German Reich government on the entry of German troops into Warsaw." Russia quickly allowed Germany to circumvent the economic blockade which Britain had placed upon the country, which had temporarily isolated it. In the secret agreement of September 28th of 1939, Russia gave Nazi Germany unrestricted usage of Soviet territory and railways to receive goods from Romania, Iran, Afghanistan, and China. Stalin prepared a secret naval base known as Basis Nord in the Kola region to support German raiders, while Soviet ships opened the Northern Sea route for German vessels. Indeed, the German commerce raider Comet took this Arctic Sea route via Soviet waters to attack Allied shipping in late 1940. Soviet railways and ports likewise carried German supplies. For example, Soviet Ukraine was a transit route for Romanian oil bound for Germany. As the German Foreign Ministry official Karl Schnurr stated, "Our sole economic connection with Iran, Afghanistan, Manchukuo, Japan, and also with South America is the route across Russia, which is being used to an increasing extent for German raw material imports." Pravda, mind you, the leading Soviet publication of the era, editorialized on September 30th of 1939, "There's no justification for a war between France and Britain on the one side and Germany on the other, a war which is quite meaningless. It is up to France and Britain to end a war which was begun against the will of their peoples." It added, "The hostility which the imperialist warmongers have fomented between the two greatest countries in Europe," of course referring to Nazi Germany and the USSR, "is now at an end." In January of 1940, it released a paper which stated, "The war was declared by Britain and France. The peace proposals were not rejected by Germany, but by Britain and France, who insist not only on continuing the war, but on spreading it." If Russia had cut off Germany from the usage of its railway lines, Germany would have absolutely no way to import from almost any nation around the world, and the war would have been over years sooner than 1945. However, Russia pursued the most friendly and welcoming relations which it possibly could have, therefore delegitimizing the stance propped up by modern communists that Russia was going to betray Germany eventually. Trust me, it just needed more time. Stalin expressed in the most explicit manner, contrary to the aforementioned sentiment, his desire to befriend the Axis powers, particularly the Japanese imperialists, as lead Japanese diplomat and Minister of Foreign Affairs Yosuke Matsuoko reported. "Then Stalin publicly asked for me, and when he found me, he came up to me and threw his arm around my shoulders, saying, 'We must remain friends, and you must now do everything to that end.'" Somewhat later, Stalin turned to the German acting military attaché, Colonel Kurbs, first made sure that he was German, and then said to him, "We will remain friends with you in any event." One could brush these off as simple diplomatic words of appeasement if it weren't for quite literally everything else Stalin and his administration did to maintain their relationship with the Reich, such as declaring that waging war for a destruction of Hitlerism was in fact a criminal act. Soviet diplomat V.M. Molotov on October 31st of 1939 stated, "One may accept or reject the ideology of Hitlerism, as well as any other ideological system. That's a matter of political views. But everybody should understand that an ideology can't be destroyed by force, that it cannot be eliminated by war. It's therefore not only senseless, but criminal to wage such a war as a war for the destruction of Hitlerism, camouflaged as a fight for democracy." If all of this weren't enough, in a twisted turn of events, the Soviets would give Germany 43,054 Polish prisoners, or 33% of all of the Poles who had ever been captured by the Soviet military up until that point in the war. Many of these Poles would find their ways into Nazi concentration camps where they would perish. In 1940, a trade agreement was organized between Nazi Germany and the USSR, which benefited the Reich's economy immensely, as the rubber and zinc which the Reich obtained from Russia was as important to them as Russia's timber was important to the Brits. Joseph Stalin stated, almost hilariously to Karl von Ritter, if we, Russia and Germany, go on collaborating like this for another 4 or 5 years, Russia will be able to produce enough raw materials to supply 2 Germanys. On the other hand, Pravda, on February 18th of 1940, released a publication which stated all the agreements reached between Germany and the USSR during the last 3 months, the Non-Aggression Pact, the Boundary and Friendship Treaty, and lastly the Economic Agreement, have established a solid and lasting basis for the development of cordial economic and political relations between the two states. They fully correspond to the basic interests of the German and Soviet peoples, to the interests of peace, and to the interests of the popular masses in every country. Karl Schnur ran the calculations of the balance sheet for the trade agreement between the USSR and Nazi Germany and found that the deliveries were set well to the benefit of Germany, as in a single year Soviet grain deliveries to Germany were 1 million tons, as well as 900,000 tons of oil and more than 500 tons of metal ore. Even the day before Operation Barbarossa, a Soviet train carrying 2,100 tons of rubber entered into the Reich to deliver it to the armed forces. Soviet Russia, despite Nazi Germany's intentional delays in holding up its end of the bargain throughout the course of the agreement, stayed faithful and true to its new Nazi compatriots in delivering absolutely all resources which it had promised up until the very day it was betrayed by the Nazis in Operation Barbarossa. In an interview on September 14th of 1945, Prince Kono of Japan would state, again in September, Stammer, the German ambassador to Tokyo, informed the Japanese government that the German-Soviet agreement had worked out remarkably well and that it had been faithfully carried out by Russia right up to the delivery of the last drop of oil. Ribbentrop brought confirmation to the words expressed by Prince Kono regarding Karl Stammer's report in a conversation with Benito Mussolini, the Prime Minister of Fascist Italy, stating, in confidence, the Reich Foreign Minister can announce that Russia is being very generous in supplying raw materials and is using some of her own gold to buy raw materials which Germany needs. Archival reports do well to show us the scale of Soviet shipments to Germany. By late 1940, one German diplomat reported, Russia has supplied over 300 million Reichsmarks worth of raw materials, roughly 100,000 of which was grain to Germany, while only 150 million Reichsmarks in German goods returned. He adds that this transfer was at the expense of the Russians' own consumption. The Soviets were eating into their own stocks to meet German needs. Overall, deliveries included hundreds of thousands of tons of grain, oil, cotton, metals, timber, etc. In the first year of the 1940 pact alone, Moscow committed about 650 million Reichsmarks worth of exports to Germany. Though less public, some collaboration on military intelligence and training occurred. German and Soviet military attachés exchanged assessments, while earlier in the 1930s, the USSR had secretly hosted German tank and air training. After 1939, Stalin reportedly invited Wehrmacht generals to brief Red Army officers. Most interestingly, Stalin's own military staff included a number of German advisors in 1940 to 1941, and Red Army officers collected German manuals. At a minimum, the two regimes, at least to our knowledge, coordinated on radio intercepts of Poland and France. The Soviet Union released an entire book entitled Falsifiers of History, in which it falsified history and attempted to debunk the obvious relations which it held with the Nazi government between 1939 and 1941. Within the prologue, the government admits that it resisted the publication of German documents which exposed the Reich's ties to the USSR under the impression that public knowledge of the coalition would make the general public more anti-communist. Falsifiers of History spends the entirety of its first chapter complaining about how the Allied powers were hesitant to resist Hitler and how Western private businesses worked with the Reich in a sad attempt to excuse the Soviet Union's own alliance with the Nazis after the war had already started. The Soviet Union then claims that it alone was doing everything in order to block the fascist aggressor's way, a flagrant lie as Russia broke away from the Allies and joined the Axis powers to pursue war conditions which benefited it more. The Soviet diplomat Viktor Israelian commented, history's falsifiers certainly did nothing to disprove the existence of Soviet-German cooperation in the first years of World War II, a cooperation that to a certain degree assisted Hitler's plan. In 1939, Stalin personally began to oversee the purge of leading Jewish Soviet officials, including two prominent Jewish commissars, party leader Artemyan Ryutin and the foreign commissioner Maxim Litvinov. Yiddish cultural institutions were already being curtailed by 1939, and by 1940 to 41, only a few Yiddish newspapers and theaters remained, and any hint of Jewish self-organization was suppressed. In the 1940 elections to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR from Western Ukraine, White Russia, and Poland, Not a single Jew was elected to the Supreme Soviet despite its 750 seats available, and within the occupied territories which the USSR had conquered, not one Jew had been placed into a single important position of power. An unexplained drop in the number of Jews in office over the previous year had occurred. During this time, mentions of the Nazi suppression of Jewish individuals had been eliminated from the press entirely as Soviet leaders began to embrace anti-Semitism. Nikolai Ivanovich Gusarov, the first secretary of the Belarusian Communist Party, complained on February 17th of 1940 that only one theater in the Belarusian Republic, a Jewish one, puts on unpatriotic plays in which life in America is praised. After the Hitler-Stalin Pact in 1939, 1 million Jews fled to Russia to escape Hitler, and in September of 1940, 10,000 GPU agents captured and deported these Jews to Siberia. Hardly any food was supplied during the 4-week trip to Siberia, where their suffering was just beginning. Hitler would eventually betray Stalin, but even throughout early reports from the armed forces and civilians, which warned that German ships were leaving Soviet harbors, Stalin ignored these as subversive rumors until it was too late. Hitler's betrayal, however, would ultimately be his undoing, as the Red Army would be marching into Berlin by spring of 1945. Following the defeat of the Nazi dictatorship, the Soviet military administration in Germany erected a network of special camps, as they were called. These special camps were built on the bones of nothing other than old Nazi prisons and concentration camps. Between May of 1945 and January 6th of 1950, 10 principal camps held upwards of 157,000 detainees under direct control of the NKVD and later the MVD. These were death camps of malnutrition, disease, and utter isolation. Under NKVD Order Number 00315, April 18th of 1945, Soviet authorities were to round up anybody deemed a hostile element. Some former Nazis, some suspected werewolf youths, while others were social democrats, landowners resisting the theft of their property by the Soviet Empire, journalists, or simply anybody suspected of anti-Soviet activity. No evidence was required because arrests were purely administrative, without any judicial oversight required. Detainees were classed either as interned with no trial, or, in a minority of cases, sentenced by a Soviet military tribunal whose trial took about 15 to 20 minutes on average. From the moment they arrived, prisoners were wrenched from the world with no mail or visitors allowed. Tuberculosis, dysentery, typhus, and dystrophy ran rampant. Although they received standard rations compared to the rest of the Soviet-occupied zones, they had no black markets, so inmates starved. Unlike Nazi camps, there was no forced labor, but that only compounded the stagnation and physical decline. By late 1946, camp populations peaked at over 80,000 men, women, and even children, as many as 10,000 youth under 18. Half of these youth never returned. In the first half of 1947 alone, 31,404 individuals had died, 60,774 remained alive but debilitated, 43% were suffering from serious illnesses such as dystrophy, tuberculosis, or open wounds. Officially, 43,035 people died. Only 45,261 were ever freed. The remainder were deported to the Gulag or reclassified as prisoners of war, or alternatively handed over to East German authorities. 756 were executed outright. Few dared to speak. In 1946, Eugen Koga noted in Der SS Stat that the NKVD camps had become a mirror image of Nazi brutality, stating, anyone suspected of being a state enemy, agent of a foreign power, class enemy, or kulak was seized. The only difference was that they were not gassed, but starvation, disease, and isolation did their work. Others, like Franz Neumann, observed on an SPD platform in 1948, the camps are the same, but in 1948, the hammer and the sickle have replaced the swastika. After the war, Ernest, a Jewish publishing house, was shut down by the state. Ennenkeit, the only Yiddish daily paper, was suspended as well. Not one Yiddish newspaper or publishing house existed anywhere in Russia by mid-1949, and critics who held Jewish ancestry, such as Johann Altmann, a theater critic, were targeted in Stalin's anti-cosmopolitan campaign. Johann Altmann was denounced as a double dealer, a man with the dark soul of a traitor, a servant of the imperialist West, a diversionist in art. Of the 50 or so intellectuals attacked by the USSR between mid-February and April of 1949 under the anti-cosmopolitan campaign, 49 of them were Jewish. Pravda, referring to cosmopolitans on January 28th of 1949, released a paper stating, "They penetrate our press and operate most freely in the pages of the magazine, theater, and the newspaper. They represent a rootless cosmopolitanism which is deeply repulsive and inimical to Soviet man. They obstruct the development of Soviet literature. The feeling of national Soviet pride is alien to them." Between July 17th and 27th of 1949, dozens of Jewish editors of Russian ran papers in occupied territories, such as Berliner Tägliche Rundschau, Der Abend, Die Volkstime, Ostreichscher, I'm not going to say that, Zeitung, and Volkswacht were unanimously dismissed from their posts. The chief editor of the Volkstime, a Jew, supposedly committed suicide, while the chief editor of Abend, a Jew as well, was arrested and deported. The National Democratic Party of East Germany, NDPD for short, would be founded in 1948 by the former SS officer Wilhelm Adam. It would attain 35 seats in the East German legislature in 1950, becoming the fifth most powerful party in East Germany out of 12 total parties in the legislature. Stalin had suggested that the Nazi paper known as the People's Observer be revived as an official newspaper of the National Democratic Party of East Germany to appeal to former Nazis, a proposal which was in the end rejected, of course. Starting in 1951, Stalin's security organs had alleged that a cabal of prominent Jewish doctors was planning to poison top Soviet leaders, inspired, of course, by the medieval blood libel that Jews secretly poisoned Christian Wells during the Black Death. 6 of the 9 accused physicians were Jewish, portrayed by Pravda as inhuman beasts, exploiting their medical roles to commit assassinations. Official dispatches warned of, and I quote, an international Jewish bourgeoisie nationalist organization recruiting saboteur doctors on behalf of US and British intelligence. Arrested doctors were to be beaten relentlessly. At their core, German National Socialism and Stalinist communism were nothing less than ideological siblings. Beneath the aesthetic of power was an admiration of organized terror against society for the sake of exalting some pure segment of the nation, be it race or class, agreeing that this end, however brutal, justified the purge of their own people to reshape civilization in their own distorted image. Consider the steps taken by these ideologues to appease each other in practice. These weren't choices made for mere political convenience. When Stalin's purges against the Jews began to echo Hitler's blood libel rhetoric, and when East Germany's National Democratic Party began to recycle old SS officers, the mask finally slipped and revealed that at the end of the day, the communist system trafficked in the same currency of fear, exclusion, and control. History's lesson is unfortunate. Communism and Nazism, though dressed in different colors, marched to the same drumbeat, wielding their ideologies not as outreached hands, but as hammers against the aspirations of their own people.